welcome to this In Conversation event. It's In Conversation, Sexual Violence and Criminal Justice Approaches in Psychology, in History and in Literature. So we're really, really thrilled that so many people could come to this event. I have some rather boring housekeeping to do to start with, so just bear with me for a few minutes, but it's quite important. I've written it down here so I don't forget anything. Basically, three things I want to just mention. We're going to be running this as a conversation. We will talk, the panelists will talk for about 50 minutes. So that'll give us about 40 minutes left for discussion, to hearing your views, your experiences, which we are really, really keen to hear. So while we are speaking, can you please use the chat function to put your thoughts? This is because your sound and your videos have all been turned off. So you can communicate with us through the chat function. If you don't know where that is, if you look at the bottom right of the screen, there's a purple button. If you click on that purple button, then it'll open a side panel, and there's 4 icons in that panel. The one you want is the one with the speech bubble. So that's the chat icon. So please, we're going to be taking questions after this main session. So just whatever you want to say or whatever you're thinking in that chat function. Please remember, though, that the main panelist screen and the chat function will be recorded. So please just don't put anything personal in that chat function. Second point is troubleshooting. We're hoping that there are not going to be any problems with connections. But if there is a problem, in the chat, you'll see a troubleshooting guide. So please just have a read of that guide. My opinion, generally, it's always solved if you just go out and then go out of the session and then log back in. But hopefully it'll run very smoothly. And finally, safeguarding. The things we're talking about can be distressing. And they can bring up difficult emotions. When you signed up for this event, you would have received a safeguarding document. That document is also in the chat. So if you need at any stage to have a look at that, please just find it in the chat, and it gives you guidance and resources that you may use. But welcome again. That's all of the boring stuff over and done with. We're really, really thrilled that you're all able to come to this event. And of course, there's lots of excuses that we can find for events like this, but the main one on this occasion is we want to welcome Winnie M Li to our writer in residence at the Shame Project here at Birkbeck. She's our first writer in residence, so she's going to go down in history for that. She's going to be with us between now and May. And, she's worked out a whole range of really exciting events, panels, workshops, things like that. You can find out and sign up. They're all free, but you do have to sign up on our website, which is shame.bbk.ac.uk, and I think someone's going to put that in the chat now, so you have it there. And we'd really, really love to see you at those events. The next one is on the 14th of April, which looks at literature and trauma. So please come to that and to other events. I think what all these events do is explore the roles that creative writing, that literature and the arts can play in helping us all to understand sexual violence much, much better. And crucially, I think the main theme is that we believe in the power of art, literature, poetry, performance, theatre, etc., to transform our worlds. And when I was thinking about what I was going to say in these introduction statements, I really returned to my favorite poet ever, Adrienne Rich. And I'm sure most of you know her work, but if you don't, she's absolutely amazing poet. And I wrote down some of a statement that she made. She wrote that, and this is what her words: the arts are not a healing lotion, an emotional massage, a kind of linguistic aromatherapy. Neither is it a blueprint, nor an instruction manual, nor a billboard. But it can, she goes on, spread news of an awareness, a resistance that which totalizing systems want to quell. Art reaching into us for what's still passionate, still unintimidated, still unquenched. When poetry or literature, art, theatre, etc., when poetry lays its hand on our shoulder, we are to an almost physical degree touched and moved. The imagination's roads open up before us, giving the lie to that brutal dictum: there is no alternative. And so the aims, I think, of all of these activities that shame, our clear lines, the speakers here today, and I'm sure most of you, our aim really is to go beyond that belief, that false belief that there is no alternative, and suggest that in fact there are things that we can all do to create a rape-free world. There are alternatives, and the arts have a massive contribution to those alternatives. So, who are we? Okay, well, the main organizers of this event is SHAME. It stands for Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters. And we're a Wellcome Trust-funded interdisciplinary group who explore, well, we focus primarily on medical and psychiatric aspects of sexual violence. And as I say, we're an interdisciplinary group. We also cover a lot of the world. I mean, my own particular work is global history of sexual violence. I've just actually sent off my book to Princeton University Press on a global history of sexual violence. But we also have expertise in the UK, the history of, not history only, interdisciplinary, the studies involving the UK, the US, France, Spain, Ghana, and Kenya. So we do span quite a bit of the world. And the event is co-organized by Clear Lines, which Winnie was the founder, I think, should say. And it's UK's first ever festival, which looks at the arts and tries to encourage discussions around sexual violence as well as consent. And I looked at their website earlier, and they say that Clear Lines aims to, their words, create an open, honest and inclusive conversation around rape, replacing the shame and silence with insight, understanding and community. And I'm particularly thrilled that so many of you have Clear member participants are here actually today. We have three panelists. I'm one of them. My name is Joanna Bourke. I'm a historian based at Birkbeck, but I'm also the principal investigator of the SHAME project. And I really work on aspects of the history of violence and in more recent years, of course, on sexual violence. We have Winnie M Li, who's a woman of a great many talents, but today she is here because she is our writer in residence, but she's also the author of a remarkable novel. If you haven't read it, it really is a must read. It's called Dark Chapter. Thank you. And it was published in 2017, translated into, I think, 10 languages, has won many, many prizes. And I'll let her talk about it, but basically it's a fictionalized account of her own rape in 2008. And she is about to publish another book, which I hope we're going to be hearing just a little taster of, or a little bit more about later on in our discussion. And then the third speaker is Amina Memon, who is Professor of Psychology, Royal Holloway, University of London. She's a psychologist. She directs the Interdisciplinary Centre for the Study of Emotion and Law. And her particular specialties, which she'll be talking about, today include work on victim and witness memory, on secondary traumatic stress amongst medical and psychology personnel, the impact of emotion on credibility, and best practice for questioning victims of various crimes. So I'm really, really thrilled that we can talk to you all today. So let's now turn, it was a bit longer than I was hoping, but let's now turn to the main event today, and that is to have an exploration of the mental health aspects of sexual violence and how it's exacerbated by, or can be, I should say, exacerbated by criminal justice processes. So can we start with you, Winnie, if that's okay? You know, I love your novel. You know that. I propagate it everywhere. But your particular rape did not go to trial because your assailant pled guilty. But in your novel, you write at length about the mental health aspects of sexual violence. You talk quite a lot about the criminal law process. And I know you did a lot of research for this book. Can you just tell us something about your novel, how it came into being? You may want to read something from it. It's up to you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess for me, you know, how it came into being, obviously I wrote it because I was raped in 2008 by a stranger. And, you know, I think for any victim or survivor, that is an event we don't necessarily expect to have happen to you. And when it does happen to you, it fundamentally disrupts your life. And I would say temporarily destroys your life as well. So, you know, I was, the basic facts, I was walking in the park on my own on a Saturday afternoon. I was approached by a 15-year-old boy who said he was lost and he needed directions. So we had a very strange conversation, and then he kept following me. And when we got to a very remote area of that park, he violently assaulted me and raped me. So I obviously didn't expect that to have happen when I went out for a walk on a Saturday afternoon, and it changed my life. And, you know, it took me years to rebuild my life afterwards. So I think for me, when I started writing the novel, I mean, I always kind of knew I wanted to write about it because I've always been a writer. And part of me, as I was living through that entire strange experience, not just of the assaults, but everything that happened after the criminal justice process, the very long process of recovery, I realized like I hadn't actually seen a novel that had explored that kind of experience from both perspectives, from the victim and the perpetrator's perspective. And I'd always been curious to know what had happened in the life of that 15-year-old boy that had led him to being that violent to a complete stranger. And I'd always wondered if he had any inkling of the impact he had on my life. And just the thing that he decided to do to a stranger, did he have any inkling that fundamentally destroyed my life and caused me to have to spend like 5 years rebuilding it. So I wanted to use imagination and fiction to interrogate what could have been his life prior to that and afterwards, and also to narrate the experience of a survivor, because I never felt that I'd seen the survivor's experience captured realistically in a novel before. And by that, I don't mean just the assault itself, because that can only last minutes, but the very, very long tail of recovery, the very damaging process of trying to pursue justice through the criminal justice system, and then all the ways that you're judged by strangers and friends and family, the way you try to maybe hide what happened to you or not hide it. So I had never seen that experience of the survivor done justice in literature before, so I wanted to write that. So that, you know, in a nutshell, what the book's about. Do you want me to read a section from it, or hello?
I think there's a problem with reception here. I can still hear you, Winnie, but we can't see you.
Okay. Well, I mean, if you can't hear me, you can't. I mean, like,
yeah, you can hear.
Yeah, okay. So if you can't see me, I mean, you know what I look like, people, right? So I'm just gonna read, and I'm gonna hope, you know, I'm out in the countryside, so the signal's not great. But I will. Is that okay, Joanna, if I read a section?
Yeah, just do continue. We can't see anyone, but we hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna read a section. It's probably about like 3 to 4 minutes long, which comes towards, you know, as the novel's approaching its climax. So as you said, Joanna, in real life, my perpetrator pleaded guilty at the very last minute, right? So I went through kind of 10 months of dreading having to go to trial. flew over to Belfast in a complete state of paranoia, not paranoia, but complete state of just fear and anxiety. And, I had to have friends fly with me because there's no way I could have done that journey on my own. And I remember sitting in the room in the courthouse waiting for the jury to be selected when I was told by the barristers that he was going to plead guilty. So it was this very strange mixture of emotions, because on one hand I was relieved that he was going to plead guilty and we wouldn't have to go to trial. On the other hand, I felt a little bit robbed of the opportunity to tell my story in court, even though subsequently in research I realized that courtroom is not the best setting for a victim to share her story. So maybe that kind of prompted me to write the novel, because I wanted to sort of explore what that experience would have been like for me if it had gone to trial. So this part is the victim's survivor's name is Vivian. She's very similar to me, but she's sitting waiting for the jury to be selected. And this is kind of the moment where it departs from reality, because in real life he pleaded guilty, but this doesn't happen in this scene. Vivian, Detective Morrison says to her, the prosecutors just want to have a word with you. She looks up from where she'd been staring into space and sees the barristers billow in. By the way, this takes place in Belfast. William O'Leary is tall, silver-haired, and imposing, while Geraldine Simmons has her brunette hair in a bob and seems a bit more approachable, warmer. Good morning, good morning. They smile to the room, like minor celebrities. They shake hands with Vivian. This is the first time she's met them in person. 2 weeks ago, after months of asking Detective Morrison, she was finally set up on a video conference call with the prosecutors, where they answered the questions that had been building up inside her for months. Yes, it would be open to the press. Yes, it was possible for her to testify behind the screen, but they advised against it. The prosecutors smiled their hellos. Small talk about finding the courthouse, the flight, the hotel. She can't imagine they actually care. They start explaining what's happening. The defendant has pleaded not guilty to all 3 charges. That's vaginal rape, anal rape, and battery. The words fall out of their mouths so matter-of-fact, as if recalling the daily specials on the menu. How surreal to hear it spoken about in such emotionless terms. We were hoping he might plead guilty at the last minute, but you have actually shown up. She nods. She had been shocked to consider that some rape victims wouldn't show up to the trial, but this morning she's starting to understand why. But obviously, O'Leary says, he continues to plead not guilty, so he doesn't want to play that game. Simmons explains the jury is being sworn in, and then O'Leary will do the opening speech. And after that, Vivian, will be brought in to give evidence as the chief witness for the prosecution. It'll be quite straightforward, O'Leary says. Of course, we'll see you again before you take the stand, but just answer the questions I ask you and be as truthful and informative as you can be. It's quite simple. Simple. Never before has one word been so underestimated. So this is actually happening. She imagines herself stepping into that courtroom, the room that waits for her behind a closed door, where everyone will be looking at her, the rape victim. Everyone, including him. As we discussed before, O'Leary continues, we will not be using special measures, so you'll be in plain view of everyone in the courtroom, and I think that will reflect very positively on you. She's taken aback, but she knows what they mean. The rape victim who sits in plain view telling her story is the rape victim who has nothing to hide. You'll be great, Simmons is saying to her. Just be yourself. Try not to be too nervous. We'll be right there with you. But you want me to cry, she thinks. The prosecutors haven't said this, of course, but that's the implicit hope, that she will break down on the stand in front of everyone. The stress will be too much, having to see the boy will be too much, and only then, with the tears and the sobbing, will the jury and the public really see how traumatized she is. The ultimate sympathy vote. And isn't this what everyone wants to see in a courtroom? Isn't that why the public has come? Why the journalists are scribbling away? The lurid appeal of the rape case, the tearful rape victim, the remorseless rapist, the shocking details of what happens between their bodies. She sinks her thumbnail into the fleshy side of her index finger, willing it to hurt, wanting to feel something, some pain. So do you have any questions for us, Vivian? Yes, some part of her says, surprisingly able to locate her voice. Does that mean there's a lot of people in the public gallery right now? How full is the courtroom? Simmons hesitates. Well, given the high profile of the case, are there many journalists inside? I wouldn't worry about it, O'Leary says. Journalists or not, just answer the questions as best you can and try to pretend no one's there. She wants to laugh at how ridiculous that last comment is. And that's the section I decided to read. I suppose for me, I wanted to read that section because I wanted to try to capture the emotional state I was in, or I suppose any rape victim would be in, as you're waiting to testify in front of the courtroom. And I guess obviously if you read the novel, you will have gone through the entire experience of Vivian, and you will have realized how absolutely terrified she is at that moment. So it's just, I wanted to kind of contrast, I suppose, the almost kind of throwaway casual manner that the prosecutors have, where they're like, oh yeah, no, just be yourself, just be normal, like, you know, try not to be nervous, and how ridiculous it is for a victim who's in that circumstance, who's probably, you know, who's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, whose life has been completely upended, who's having to face the prospect of seeing her rapist again in public in a room, and how just absolutely terrifying it is. Because I think a lot of members of the public maybe don't realize it, and they don't realize how traumatizing and difficult the criminal justice system can be for victims. And I think, you know, maybe the system is actually failing victims if it's actually causing that much crime, if it's causing that much anxiety and panic. I mean, certainly in my experience, I contemplated suicide before having to go to trial, and I think quite a lot of victims themselves contemplate suicide at one point, especially because the stress of going to trial can be that much. So I think we need to really kind of interrogate the existing system.
Great. Thanks very much, Winnie. And sorry that we lost the videos there. I think it's going to be put in the chat though. If you refresh your windows, I think you'll find it comes back. I've just done it myself and it did come back. So I think that's the way forward for that. You know, I'm going to ask Amina shortly about why the criminal justice process is so traumatic for victims and for witnesses. But before that, can I just say a few words about the history of these sorts of issues? I mean, my own work looks at Britain and America from the late 18th century to the present. And what was really striking for me, and this links into what Winnie was saying about trauma and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and that is just how modern, just how recent the idea of trauma, whether it's rape trauma or indeed any other kind of trauma, is historically. I mean, the concept, I mean, nowadays, you know, we talk about trauma in a very casual way. We all think we know what it is. It's something, it's an inevitable outcome of a very, very bad experience. But actually, the concept of trauma as we understand it today is actually very recent. It was invented first in the 1860s. And the concept, so in other words, the idea of trauma as an internal response to a bad external happening is an 1860s invention, if you like. John Erik Erikson was the person who did it, and he was the one who changed this idea of trauma from a physical wound, a trauma in Greek. We still have it in the sense of trauma wards in hospitals, to an internal wound. But, you know, I was really shocked when I started doing this work, just how long it took for medical professionals, for justice systems, justice professionals, and even, you know, general public to actually accept the great emotional trauma that results from sexual abuse. I mean, certainly in my research in the British context, it's slightly different argument in the European context. You know, this really doesn't start happening until the 1970s. It starts slightly in the 60s, but really until the 1970s, victims of sexual assault actually were not given any kind of emotional support or counseling or anything like that. Indeed, most of them were dealt with in the context of religious authorities. So you get rape victims going to hospital, and the people in charge of their emotional well-being were in fact the chaplains. And that doesn't change, as I say, until very, very late, which I find really quite shocking. And it's not until the 1970s that two fantastic feminist nurses and social workers, Burgess and Holstrom, invent this term rape trauma syndrome, which in my view is caused a real revolution in the way we understand, the way professionals as well as general public understand sexual violence, because their great breakthrough was that trauma, emotional distress were normal. They were not abnormal. But I don't want to go into more of that. We can talk about that more later. Amina, I mean, it's really very interesting to contrast your work with that of Winnie. I mean, you've written extensively about investigative interviewing, about vulnerable witnesses. Can you just say something about just why is the criminal justice process so traumatizing for victims, but also for witnesses? Really love to hear what you think.
Yeah, it can be traumatizing for both victims and witnesses. And interestingly, Winnie's extract touches on some of the reasons why that is. Partly because there's this expectation that there'll be this universal response to trauma, and people have a very fuzzy idea of what trauma means and what symptoms to expect, especially when it comes to something that is highly stigmatized, highly interpersonal. So I think there's definitely a lack of understanding and this kind of expectation that when we're trying to understand human behavior, we need to be able to predict it and understand it. And so when you're confronted with a heinous crime like rape, you're looking for some explanation for why it occurred, and also expecting a witness or victim to show behavior that matches what your expectations and beliefs are about how this person should be presenting themselves. And I think what people are trying to do is trying to kind of put themselves in those in the shoes of the victim witness, but at the same time, from the investigative perspective, one has to be objective, and the principle of a good investigative interview is to find out what, if anything, has occurred. But what the investigator really hasn't taken into account is how the traumatic nature of the incident is going to affect the victims and witnesses' behavior, and that really, at the end of the day, it's those non-legal factors to do with the impression that the witness conveys that is going to undoubtedly influence decision-making, and that's not how it should be. And added to that is what we refer to as the secondary victimization that comes as a result of going through the whole criminal justice process. And victims and witnesses have reported that process of going through the criminal justice system can be as traumatizing, as distressing as the trauma that comes from the crime itself, the rape itself. And so this is the kind of situation that we're in, and there is research to support that from psychology. We do have a very good understanding of how people's beliefs and myths concerning victims of rape, and also the lack of understanding about the effects, the way in which trauma affects the way people present themselves, the way they remember, and how that comes across in an interview and then later on in the courtroom.
Yeah, great. I mean, you work on the role of psychologists today in creating a narrative which is used by authorities and the public more generally in terms of how we perceive questions of believability. Can you just say a little bit more about that? Because reading your work, I was very, very interested in those sorts of issues.
Yeah, so my main interest is in sort of how victims and witnesses come across. So this is to do with credibility. And undoubtedly, it is how credible a witness appears, as well as how much information they have about what happened to them, that is going to influence the outcome of a case, or actually determine whether a case proceeds, Crown prosecution decide to further investigate, or the police decide to further investigate. So things like beliefs about how a victim should have behaved, their previous, their character, their relationship with the accused, what the reasons for why the disclosure is delayed, the signs that they show, or the lack of visible signs of injury, and that could include psychological signs, the degree to which they have beliefs about how somebody in this situation should appear and come across. So Winnie referred to crying while recounting the event, and also how somebody who's traumatizing appears. And one of the things I've been focusing on is something called the emotion victim effect, which is adults who express negative emotions when providing their account or narrating their account in court or an interview are typically perceived as more credible than victims who display little or no emotion. And this is really problematic because it hugely varies how people respond to and cope with negative life events. And indeed, even when it comes to PTSD, PTSD is comprised of a number of different symptoms. So you could be feeling as if you're re-experiencing the event. You could be in a state of immobility and completely frozen. You may be deliberately avoiding things related to the event. There may be changes in the way in which you think about the event and yourself. And these are things that we really do need to be educating the police and the courts about, to understand that individuals respond very differently to how victims portray and present themselves. But in addition to that, the other thing that we've been looking at is this whole problem of victim blaming. I mean, it's natural for humans to want to come up with reasons and explanations and justifications for why something horrific and that doesn't make sense occurred. And what can happen then is, and this is one of the reasons that secondary victimization can occur, is that we know that this lack of understanding can result in victim blaming, implying only certain types of women become victims of this sort of crime. It can result in perpetrators and the accused being exonerated, and most problematic, disbelief in claims of rape. So, this blame, discrimination, loss of status, isolation, in addition to the shame that comes, can really impact victims, resulting in this secondary traumatization. And that is inherently linked to how they may come across. And then it comes down to credibility, which has nothing to do with evidence. It has everything to do with how the witness comes across and how that person who's seeing that witness is interpreting their behaviour. And most recently, we've been doing a literature review to look at the impact of remote interviewing. And obviously, during the pandemic, interviews are being conducted remotely increasingly. And one of the vulnerable groups that we especially interested in at the Centre for the Study of Emotion and the Law are refugees and asylum seekers. And the Home Office is clearly moving towards, they were before the pandemic, remote interviews. And here you may have individuals that are testifying about horrific acts of torture and sexual violence, for example, and they're going to be giving their evidence remotely. And we don't know yet how that's going to affect how they come across. We are a bit concerned about the fact that they'll be giving their testimonies in remote locations, potentially without appropriate support measures in place. But we're really concerned about how credible they're going to come across. And, and in addition to the fact that, we've got cultural factors on top of that, which are going to mean people from different backgrounds may display their signs and present themselves in quite different ways, non-verbally and in their facial expressions and in the way in which they express their emotions or don't express their emotions. So there are lots of issues related to credibility that I think are going to, it's really increasingly important for us to look at.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting because actually a lot of my historical work addresses those questions in historical context, because the way victims of rape were expected, if they were to be credible, to comport themselves in courtrooms in the 19th century, for example, actually are very different from in different periods of history. But I want to come back to you, Winnie. I mean, literature, it has been such a powerful force in communicating the harms of sexual abuse, as well as exploring ways that victims and survivors are treated in these different contexts. Can you just say something more about this powerful effect of literature?
Yeah, I mean, I think I also sort of wanted to tag on to something Amina had said in terms of the emotion victim effect and how you come across as more credible as a victim if you display emotion. And for me, that was exactly kind of what I felt was being offered to me or suggested, that I should break down in court if it had gone to trial, because that would make me more believable as a rape victim. And I suppose it's just, everything's just so artificial, right? Because, I mean, the trial system itself is completely artificial, you know, to try to adjudicate, you know, what happened or the truth of what happened by putting a victim in the same room as the perpetrator and having a jury of randomly selected, you know, members of the public, and how that setup is somehow supposed to lead to discovering the truth just seems completely weird. And the other thing is, obviously, and I try to kind of convey this in the novel, the way that barristers speak and judges speak is this very kind of theatrical legalese, where you know, even like, I'm pretty well educated. Like, when I sat down and sat through a number of different trials, I was like, I don't even understand what they're saying half the time, right? Because the questions are framed in such a weird way and such a kind of vaunted form of, you know, vocabulary that, you know, how can members of the everyday public really understand what the questions are, especially because you often have a pretty big difference in class and education level between the barristers and the judges and then the people that they're representing, right? So it's a very artificial theater, the courtroom, right? And part of me just kind of thought, well, this is ridiculous that I should be in this situation expected to break down, because as somebody who, you know, is pretty well educated and likes to be articulate, like, for me, I don't want to break down, because if I'm speaking in public, like, what if I was speaking in public right now and I broke down into tears, right? That would completely change the tenor of this entire discussion. So on sort of a professional level, like, I'm not used to breaking down, but then in this case of a rape trial, I would be expected to break down, because that's what we expect of a rape victim. And if she doesn't break down, well, clearly she's somehow not telling the truth or something. So I think we really do need to interrogate the expectations we have for how victims should be reacting to these kinds of situations, because, you know, as Mina has said, people react in all sorts of different ways, which is tied to your personality, it's tied to, you know, the way you were raised, it's tied to your culture, and, you know, there isn't one template for how a victim should be reacting, which somehow communicates if she's telling the truth or not. But in regards to your question about literature, yeah, I think, you know, aside from, you know, there's two things happening right here, right? Because literature about sexual violence is generally written by survivors themselves or people who've been thinking deeply about these issues. Obviously, there's not very good literature about sexual violence, which is very much of the crime fiction genre, but there's obviously good aspects of some crime fiction that interrogate that experience. But, you know, there's the self-expression by survivors themselves who are using writing and different forms of writing to kind of try to make sense of what happened to them emotionally, right? And for me, it was, you know, I had to wait 5.5 years before I felt like I was in a place to write my own experience as fiction. So it serves kind of a, you know, I don't want to say therapeutic purpose, but it serves a certain kind of purpose for the victim or survivor themselves to be able to narrate their own story, right? And we'll probably talk about this more in the April 14th event. So there's that. And then there's also the sharing of it to the public. And obviously I know many survivors and victims who write about their own experience, but they don't want the public to read about it. And that's perfectly fine, because the putting of it into words, onto paper, is serving a purpose for themselves. But then once you publish it, or once you share it with the world, then you're getting this whole other audience of people who are reading it and hopefully getting to understand a little bit better what the actual experience is for a victim or survivor of this kind of crime. But then also there's kind of a connective thing that happens. Sorry, I should come up with better words as a writer. Sort of a connection that's happening between the reader and the writer if they both have a lived experience of sexual violence. So for me, in my own like kind of life, 2008, this all happened. 2009, I was kind of voraciously seeking out rape memoirs by other writers, because I wanted to kind of feel that what had happened to me wasn't something that was entirely isolating, because it certainly felt very isolating, but I wanted to realize that there were other people that had lived through this and had survived and been able to write about it. So there are incredible memoirs by, you know, Alice Sebold, who wrote Lucky, and Nancy Venable Rain, who wrote Right After Silence, Rape and the Journey Back, and there continue to be many more really good memoirs. And for me, that it was in some ways kind of quite life affirming to be able to read them and realize, okay, someone else has been through this terrible journey, and has been able to write about it and has been able to put their life together as a result, even though it seemed impossible, to them at one point. So, and for me, Dark Chapter has been out for a while, so people have come to me and said that they found it to be very life-affirming in their own ways as well. So I think there's that sort of the connective process of sharing your writing through literature and having other people read it is something that's very powerful. And it's different from other art forms because with the book, it's something you have absolute control over how you read it. And if something's distressing, you can put it away and return to it at some point. But it's not like a movie where you're kind of assaulted with what's happening. And, well, I guess you could stop the movie and walk out of the room. But with reading, it's something that you can read on your own terms and at your own pace. And there's something about that can be quite empowering and connecting for the reader. Yeah.
Yeah, great, Winnie. I mean, the arts are absolutely crucial in this fight to create a rape-free world. And since you advertised your book, Winnie,
there we go.
A book that I wrote a few years ago called Rape, a History from 1860 to the Present. And I'm just going to read just a few lines from near the very end of this book, which is about how important the arts are in creating a rape-free world. I wrote, the arts, they enable us to imagine and enact new ways of seeing, speaking, ways of being. They offer up worlds of resistance. They produce access to an exhilarating range of knowledges, emotions, desires, and needs, making it imaginatively possible to dream, think, and act in ways to create a future in which sexual violence has been placed outside the threshold of the human. And I'm conscious that we're almost running out of time. So just the same question to both of you. Your ideas. What are your ideas about how narrative and the arts can improve our worlds? And I'll start with you, Amina, and then Winnie.
Yeah, I think in terms of my work, really countering the myths about rape and how a victim of rape will behave, should behave, why they may be reluctant to report, why they may have supposedly given consent to something they didn't want, and why, they are feeling that they are to blame. So I think it's really important that narratives, because essentially what we're doing in the courtroom is telling our story. So the narrative is very, very powerful. And as Winnie has so clearly shown in her own writing, it also it's therapeutically beneficial for the victim to be able to do that. And I think arts is a very powerful way to communicate to the outside world that what people think as normal might be quite skewed, and it's also allows people to engage with a subject that we don't normally discuss openly in society or together in a way, and to share and discuss these things, and I think art provides a way of doing that.
Thank you, Winnie.
Yeah, I noticed somebody in the chat mentioned I May Destroy You, which I hope many of you have seen. And if you haven't, I do urge you to see it, because for me, that's a perfect example of art which, educates and illuminates a certain experience, but also is completely involving and engaging, and it's very entertaining, and it's funny at times, and it's harrowing at other times. And what's really crucial is that, Arabella, the main character, is not that sympathetic at times, right? And she's very flawed, and she makes bad decisions. And there's times where you don't necessarily agree with her, and that, and victims aren't perfect, right? And I think, what we're saying about, the emotion victim effect, like we expect all victims to break down crying. If you look at the media, because I realized somebody else mentioned in the chat about the media, if you just look at the media and their selection of rape victims they choose to give a platform for, you'd think like it's only attractive, young middle-class white women who are getting raped, and absolutely, it's obviously that's not great that that's happening to them, but it's also not great that's happening to a broad swathe of other members of society who never actually get seen visibly in the media as victims of rape, right? So, there's no perfect way to behave as a victim, and none of us actually are ever given a script on this is how we should be behaving and how we should be reacting to our trauma. So I think, the arts, that TV show was a really good example of how a victim can be flawed and can come from a different kind of background, and how situation she's in, the kind of abuse or trauma that she's subjected to, all those different things can impact on the way that she decides to behave and the way that she does behave. But that doesn't necessarily mean the assault didn't happen to her, right? So yeah, I think the arts are crucial in terms of widening the audience that starts to think about these issues a bit more in a way that's entertaining, right? And you know, and unfortunately there's that kind of interplay of the industry that creates the arts, the entertainment complex, and forms of abuse that take place within the entertainment industry, as we can see with what happened in 2017 with the Weinstein allegations and all the other allegations that came after. So, you know, as somebody who works in the arts, of course, I'm a big fan of it, but of that form. But, you know, for me, it's about bringing together all the different forms of knowledge, not just the human experience that's being explored in these artistic works, but also all the research that Amina's doing, all the research that Joanna's doing, all the work that's being done by police and the criminal justice system, and all the work that's being done by doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists on this issue, and somehow bringing it all together. And I guess that's kind of why, you know, Clear Lines likes doing these events, why we want to partner with Shame, because for me, I thought it was strange that there's so much work being done in activist circles, in different academic fields. I know a lot of artists and survivors are doing work as well, and that's not really all coming together to form a productive dialogue a lot of times. So yeah, I mean, the arts are one way for the public to engage on this issue, but I think we also need to kind of broaden the conversation to feed in the kind of research and knowledge that, you know, people like yourselves are unearthing. So yeah, and for me also, it's really about having a survivor-centered approach to these forms of research and interrogation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. A survivor-centered approach is at the heart of what we're all doing here, trying to do here. Look, we've actually spot on time. So we've got just over half an hour for discussion, questions, to hear from you, to hear about your experience. I noticed there's been a lot of chat there, so I'm afraid we can't get through all in the next half hour, but I'm going to invite Ria Sukdiosing to come and join us, because she's going to kind of moderate the chats and yeah.
Hi, great. Thanks, Joanna. And thanks to Amina and Winnie. My head is full, and I'm sure everyone else's is as well. There's so much to dig into. And as Joanna says, the chat has been very productive and generative. So I will try to pick up as much as I can. And if we don't answer your question, please do keep in touch with us afterwards. So Joanna, this first one is to you, and it's a comment that says from earlier in the talk, this history is so interesting. You'd think, though, that if we've known this since the 1970s, that we'd perhaps be a bit better at trauma-informed criminal justice solutions. And in parentheses, I definitely love to know where to read more about the history. Excited for your book. So I don't know if you have any comments to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, I've got two comments to make on that. One, which is negative, and then I'll go into something really positive. The first is that, you know, I'm an historian because I believe that things can change. Things have been different in the past. They can be different now. Unfortunately, a lot of times we don't learn from the past. And that's the negative comment. The positive comment is, though, that the past actually gives us models for how we could do things better, or at least how to think in more complex ways about doing things better. I mean, to go back to what both Amina and Winnie were talking about how you present yourself in a criminal justice kind of system. You know, this was so different in the past, and, you know, we can learn from that, I think. So that is kind of the positive thing. I mean, I do write a lot about this in my book on rape, a history. But, you know, I think that particularly when we are looking at issues of trauma, I think conceptualizing that historically is a really valuable thing to do. But I would say that because I'm a historian.
Great. Amina or Winnie, did you want to add anything to that before I pick up anything else?
No, I mean, I would say just to what we were saying earlier about kind of the power of writing, or the connective power of writing. I mean, Joanna's book, the one that you showed on screen, I came across in a bookshop, I think just a few years after I was assaulted, so after my own rape. So I came across it, I'm like, wow, there's an entire history on rape, and this woman's written this like massive thick book where she's researched all this. And bought it and I read it. And so for me, when I found out that you were leading this project, it was like, oh, I have to get in touch with Joanna Bourke. And so, there is that thing where, somebody writes a book and you come across it and maybe years later you may actually speak to them. But, it would have been different with a different kind of art form. But I think, with writing, we create these things and they exist on shelves and they stumble across them in libraries or in bookshops. And, then that somehow leads to a dialogue, which could become an actual person-to-person dialogue, years down the line. So yeah, for me, that's kind of the power of writing. I know that didn't really answer the original question, but
yeah.
Okay, we have some comments as well, and I know more added, so I'll try to get through these. So a comment that says, Winnie, you're very brave. Keep on going and own up your story. Obviously, you turned your wounds into wisdom and strength. I applaud you and very well done. And then also observations that, yes, having trauma-informed support teams is so key for witnesses and survivors. I guess getting a little bit back to historical research, secondary victimization is such an interesting concept. My research explores it in relation to Holocaust victims whose experiences of sexual violence were more often than not excluded from post-war narratives of genocidal violence. This exclusion influenced and shaped their testimony of suffering in later years. But I'll come to a question, sorry, again, it's for you, Winnie. In Winnie's novel, there is a physical difference in the appearance of the lead prosecutor, a tall and wiry man, and the defense lawyer, short and stocky. Did you aim for a kind of ironic duality of these adversarial men?
I mean, I didn't really think too much about it, to be honest. It's funny because people always ask you, like, oh, was there some meaning behind this? And I'm like, not really. But I guess in that instance, the lead prosecutor is meant to be tall and imposing, because he was in real life. But I think that's also supposed to represent how intimidating he was, not just for people that he's interrogating, but also for Vivian, the victim, as well. Because, that situation of being a victim of rape who was then trying to pursue justice through the criminal justice system and not being shown the ropes at all or explained at all how anything was going to work was very intimidating for me, right? And like I said in the section I read out from, like, I didn't even speak to the prosecuting barristers until 2 weeks before the scheduled trial, and they were pretty dismissive towards me, and they were just very kind of casual. And I remember being in this video call with the prosecuting barrister, and he was like answering questions and like twirling a rubber band and stuff, and I was just on my end, I was just like sweating bullets because I'd just been living for months dreading this thing that was going to happen. So the casual, everyday nature with which prosecutors and barristers approach this, because this is our everyday work, right? Versus the kind of life or death feeling that it is for victims and probably perpetrators as well. I just wanted to kind of somehow I guess capture in fiction, because it is weird, because these questions of justice and truth are being decided by professionals who do this every day and maybe don't have that, and because as a result of being professional, don't have this kind of emotional attachment to every single thing that happens. But to the victims and the perpetrators, like, everything that happens is completely weighted with emotion. And there's that kind of contrast. I think I'm not quite sure how to figure that out or how to come up with a system that's a bit more trauma informed. But even that indifference of the barristers can be quite damaging for victims as well, and make us feel that we're not being taken seriously.
Joanna or Amina, did you want to come in there before we pick up another point?
Just in relation to that, I think there is a really important role for advocacy here. So, it's really important that we have advocacy to improve victims' ability to kind of engage within this adversarial system that we're faced with in this country, and have support throughout navigating the criminal justice system, advice on how to cope with the process, a consistent point of contact, support in preparing for court. And recent research has shown that those who provide that support also can suffer from secondary victimization. So independent sexual violence advisors, for example, talk about the stress, but also the rewards of the job. So it's really important to have that practical and emotional support and non-judgmental advocacy to address some of these challenges.
Yeah, because you mentioned the adversarial system, and because the adversarial system, the way the defense would work would be is to completely undermine the credibility of the victim, right? Because the prosecution puts out their case of what happened, which if the case actually happened, which would be the case if this is being pursued, a rape took place, right? But then the defense barrister would then try to come up with every reason in the book to undermine the credibility of the victim and to imply that she's making it up, or she's acting out of anger or envy or what have you. And I can think of nothing more dehumanizing and nothing more insulting as a rape victim to be told that what happened to you didn't happen and you're just making it up, because that's completely insulting, right? So there's something very dehumanizing about that adversarial system for victims, and that really needs to be fixed, I think.
This, I think, leads a little bit well into a couple of comments that are sort of connected. So someone in the chat says, I know someone whose SOIT officer told them they looked too cheerful in their video evidence and that the jury might not believe them just before she gave evidence. And then a question that says, yeah, thank you, Winnie, for sharing your experience. But also, what would have been helpful to you in terms of feeling better supported around going to court, which I think you've sort of touched on. Any thoughts on accessing therapy while you had to wait for the trial?
Yeah, I mean, that touches on a few things, because I've spoken to victims who were told by the police that they can't get therapy while they were waiting for the trial to happen, right? Because it would somehow, if they gave an account of what happened to their therapist, which was slightly different from what they told to the police, that would undermine their credibility as a victim. So I know, victims that had to wait 2 years before they were able to access therapy, and that's completely not trauma-informed approach. That can be very damaging. I mean, you're already in a very vulnerable situation as a victim of trauma, but then to be told that you can't access therapy while you're waiting for the trial to happen is, it's completely damaging. But that's also a myth as well. I mean, people are told that, but in reality, I think you can actually access therapy. I was very lucky to have a good, what do you call it, CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, thanks to the NHS, while I was waiting for the trial. But I was on a waiting list for like 10 months, and then finally had to fill out all these forms and answer all these different questionnaires to prove that I deserved that kind of therapy. So it can be a very long process to get therapy, and that's for the people that speak up for it, right? And I actually had to advocate quite a lot through my GP, because they sent me to somebody first who assessed me and said, oh no, she seems perfectly cheerful. Going back to the earlier comment, cheerful and bubbly and articulate, so she probably doesn't need therapy that much. And I went back to my GP. I'm like, okay, well, that's bullshit, because I need therapy still, right? Just because I present as somebody cheerful, doesn't mean that I haven't been raped, right? And I don't need therapy. So, there's this huge bureaucratic system in terms of being able to even access therapy, which can be a detriment to survivors. And often I found that in order to access resources for survivors, you would still have to be sharing your experience over and over again, and that gets really exhausting. So I had to call up HMRC and explain to the guy on the end of the phone why I needed incapacity benefit, because I couldn't work because I'd been raped. And so again, there's something quite dehumanizing about having to share your experience of trauma over and over again to strangers just to jump through the bureaucratic hoops to get resources that you need as a victim. But I've been speaking too much, so I'll let you get on to the other questions.
Just so you know, the Crown Prosecution Service had finally updated their 2002 guidance. So this year we should get the new guidance, which supports therapy, and there's guidance for therapists and for the criminal justice professionals to say that it's absolutely important that victims receive therapy throughout the process. It does mean that clinicians have to keep notes, and there are issues of making that clear, and it may well affect disclosure and obviously privacy, but we are moving towards accepting that it's very important that therapy is provided throughout the process, and that documentation should be published this year.
Great to hear.
That's great. Thanks, Amina. And I think, I know there are a lot of comments here around like media representation. I think we can definitely try to pick those up again, but just to sort of, I guess, a little bit follow on this thread. There's another comment here. The presentation of PTSD expert evidence in GBV cases has had a turbulent recent history, with general evidence advising jurors of the reality of survivor response being recommended and then removed in the interest of supposed fairness to the defendant. Should general expert evidence about PTSD be made mandatory in sexual offense trials?
Really interesting question. I think we're going to have huge obstacles in that, because already as a psychologist, giving PTSD, testifying on non-medical issues and clinical issues, it can be really challenging because you have to establish relevance of the testimony. I think it is really important to educate the judiciary about PTSD and how a witness with PTSD may present themselves. Whether expert testimony is the best way to do that, I don't know, but there certainly needs to be training and guidance there to guide the court. And I think currently there isn't. And this is another issue that I come across when looking at the testimony of asylum seekers for obvious reasons. And, it can explain why there may be gaps in people's memory, where there may be inconsistencies in their accounts. So there's definitely a role of some kind of evidence-based advice or testimony, what form that takes. I think we're going to be in a battle to try and make that happen. But yes, I know it happens in some countries already, in some jurisdictions. So it's a really good question.
I think there's some reform happening in Northern Ireland right now. The Gillen report, so Sir John Gillen, who used to be a judge, has been conducting all this research with professionals and also survivors who've been through the system, survivors of sexual abuse and assault. And he's put forward a number of different recommendations. And one of those suggestions is to have, not quite a training video, but like a video that explains the different impacts of trauma and, explains the responses of PTSD for the jury to watch before, the trial starts. That hasn't been approved yet. And there's that same debate about, is that really creating a neutral ground? But, for me, obviously from my perspective, I think it is important for the public, that makes up the jury to understand that there are different ways of reacting, that victims have different ways of reacting to trauma. And that could explain how they present or how they don't remember, certain details. So, but I think it's always going to be a thorny debate, unfortunately, I think.
So there are a couple, I don't know if this might be, something for you, Joanna. I'm going to link up a couple things here about like stereotypes around victims and how they present. So there's a comment that says, I think that's so much. I think there's so much about said coping mechanisms, and also the stereotype of the victim is so important. About so-called facades or front a victim may maintain to survive, but is used against them ultimately. People seeing other people in influential and varying fields can help perpetuate ideas against stereotypes, but they may not always feel able to come forward for a number of reasons. A barrister may be a survivor, but be in an abusive relationship and do their job well day to day. A surgeon might treat someone well and be a survivor of rape. A police officer may investigate deaths as part of their job, but may have a history of violence. And then a comment I think that maybe takes us into probably your historical research, which is the idea that some women cannot be victims of rape and sexual violence, Black women especially, has been commented on by Black feminists in the 70s and 80s. In your research, is that still the case?
Yeah, those are both really two excellent points and questions. Certainly these stereotypes are deeply embedded in our history. That's why they're so difficult to debunk and get rid of. Any of us can be a victim of sexual violence, and any of us indeed can be a perpetrator, even though perpetrators do tend to fit certain characteristics. But certainly a lot of my work looks at the victims who are actually underrepresented in the broader literature, in particular victims who have developmental or intellectual difficulties, which is a group of victims who are dealt a particularly hard card in terms of justice systems. They are not believed, even more not believed than others, if that's possible. But also there is often paternalistic attitudes that, oh, it's better if we don't take this to trial because she or he will be more traumatized by it if we take it to trial or if we take it seriously. So those victims really do suffer. And as you say, the person said, minoritized communities are another one. Boys and men are actually another one. I mean, 1 in every 5 girls and women will experience some form of sexual abuse in their lifetime, but actually 1 in every 8 to 10 boys and men will also. So it's not an insignificant number. And there have been lots of historical reasons why those victims have been sidelined. I mean, feminists have, I think, rightly been concerned that by focusing attention on boys and men, you will actually drown out even more the voices of girls and women, who still are, of course, most of the victims and survivors of this. In terms of Black women and minoritized groups, this is a major issue within our societies. And as I said in the introductions, I've just finished writing a global history of sexual violence, where I focused a lot on those minoritized communities who are dealt a bad hand, but also there is also a more stigma attached to them coming forward in public. So that is a real problem, I think, within our society. So actually, I don't think it's become better. I think the positive thing here is that there is a lot and growing amount of activism around it. And, we hear a lot about, #MeToo. If you look at the history of Me Too, you can really trace it back to slavery, female slaves in America, who actually were some of the first people in that continent to come forward publicly to tell their stories, and making very interesting arguments about, on the one hand, the difficulties, on the one hand, the fact that they are being abused by their so-called masters, their so-called owners, but also that tension about that sometimes the abusers are fellow slaves, so stigmatizing their own communities. So those huge debates about that, and certainly also civil rights, Black women also extremely prominent in the anti-rape movement. And that's kind of been lost with the rise of, if you like, white middle-class feminism of the 1970s.
Yeah.
Did either of you want to add to that, Amina or Winnie? Otherwise, I might say...
just adding to what Joanna said, the Office of National Statistics measure of violent crime really omits the whole intersectionality problems. So it omits the number of people experiencing rape, attempted rape, and indecent assaults or domestic violence. And the one group that is really underestimated are sort of Black and minoritized women. And so there's a real problem there, I think, that needs to be addressed.
If I think add another... Sorry.
So this might lead into it, Joanna. So there's a question that leads on asking specifically, is there research being done about how age or race affects ability to provide testimony, or how it affects credibility? Can you speak to that? Is the research that's happening?
There's a huge amount of research, particularly in recent years, about that. But if you're interested in this, the best thing to do, really, in my view, is to look at IMCAN's website. They released a report, when was it? Well, just before the pandemic, which we have a blog about it on the same website.
It's called Reclaiming Violence. It's Reclaiming Justice, IMCAN's report. Really interesting. Last year it came out. I think I can bring it up and put the reference in the chat.
Great, thanks. But also on our website, we have an interview with one of the founders of IMCAN, Lara Sai. So please listen to that, because she speaks so eloquently about this precise issue.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I just put IMCAN's main website there, and exactly you can find the report as well, which is really powerful. I guess to get back to a bit of also what we've been talking about the court process being adversarial. So someone asks, do you have any specific ideas about what might replace the adversarial process? I completely agree that it is ill-equipped for dealing with sexual offenses, but struggle to think what would adequately replace it, which would equally protect the rights of the accused.
I mean, this is quite radical. I don't know if it's ever going to get implemented in this country, but I do think that having trial by jury is a big problem for cases of sexual violence. I mean, in other countries, for example, France, you'll have, 3 judges who will decide this, and France does have quite a lot of female judges as well. I do think there's a huge problem with having members of the public decide whether or not an accused rapist actually raped someone, for example, because, as we can see from all the sorts of victim blaming comments that are out there, as we can see from the way that our own friends and family can react to these disclosures, everybody has certain kinds of misperceptions and stereotypes about rape and what rape victims are like and what rapists are like in their heads, and to try to present the truth, or to try to present an account and then another account and have them ascertain the truth is, I think, virtually impossible, because you're having to deal with all those rape myths. You're having to deal with all those kind of victim blaming tendencies, right? Because, members of the public aren't really that educated about this issue. And even like my own experience, like I don't claim to be the expert on it because somebody else could have a completely different experience, right? So we know that victims and also perpetrators behave in completely different ways. And then we also know that people are going to have certain assumptions that somebody's behavior or the way they present doesn't match with that assumption. They're going to doubt the credibility of that person. So you're going to have members of the public deciding beyond a reasonable doubt whether or not somebody actually committed a rape or not. Like, it's basically having like a bunch of kindergartners trying to like figure out how to launch a rocket ship, right? Because, we're dealing with levels of, I guess not like lack of education and lack of awareness about a topic, which often isn't spoken about and is often silenced. And that somehow we have to battle through all that to kind of ascertain the truth and to administer justice. So I think, I personally wouldn't be a fan of having members of the public decide, what happens to my own rapist, right? So I think having experts and having judges that are trained in these issues and are kind of aware of all the different ways in which people react to trauma, and are familiar with the ways that perpetrators might actually act, and the ways that perpetrators may have a series of victims, would be a better way of going about it. So that's one thing. Obviously, I don't think having the victim and the perpetrator in the same room is helpful for anyone. I don't think having members of the public present or members of the jury, members of the press present are helpful either. I mean, all these things can be videotaped and watched later on to see if it's a fair circumstance. But I just think there is so much exposure there that makes it really difficult for the victim. Obviously somebody who's a legal expert can probably speak about, what is the best thing to ensure a fair trial for the accused. But those are just a few ideas I have.
I mean, I totally agree with what you say, Winnie. One of the problems is kind of the unconscious bias and the implicit bias that even a judge may have, and it's really difficult. I mean, it's kind of normal for us when we're presented with a lot of information to take shortcuts, and that's when we rely on our stereotypes. And I totally agree with what you say about juries, and the adversarial system is clearly not the way to deal with this, but judges can also be subject to biases. So we need very rigorous training and educating, and maybe a completely different system, more of an inquisitorial system to deal with rape investigations and prosecutions.
I don't know whether it's worth returning a little bit to questions around art interventions, Winnie. So someone asked earlier on, if I can find it now, scrolling up, it was, as a partner of a survivor, I can't imagine pushing them on a journey of recovery or seeking justice, but is there art that speaks gently to the beginning of that journey?
Yeah, I think Joe wrote that, and then he wrote later on, thanks, you've partly answered my question. I mean, there is a lot of art out there, and I'm trying to think what art is gentle about it. Because obviously there's lots of different ways in which rape is represented in the arts and entertainment, and some of it can be quite traumatizing. I mean, for me, books and poetry is a very gentle art form in some ways, because it can be hard to understand what's happening in poetry, but it also allows the reader to kind of to divine their own meaning in the words, right? So, so there is some pretty amazing poetry out there about these kinds of experiences. I'm gonna put some names in the chat because suddenly I'm like on the spot and I gotta name some poets. I'll put some names in the chat soon. You know, but I think some of the memoirs I mentioned earlier by survivors of stranger rape are very powerful. So for me, kind of the key that unlocked a lot of stuff was Nancy Venable Rain's After Silence, Rape in My Recovery, or Rape in the Journey Back, which, you know, a lot of these memoirs are written years after the survivor's gone through that trauma. And in some ways, the opening of Dark Chapters is meant to be written years after, when Vivian is looking back on the moments just before she was raped. And there's something quite, I don't know, kind of quite life-affirming about hearing from victims many, many years after it happened, who are in a better place themselves and who've had time to take stock of what happened and can tell kind of a story about how this thing happened to them and how they were able to recover. So I'd say a lot of those rape memoirs, and again, I can put some names in the chat, are quite useful. And just having a book that you can come back to when you feel like it, where no one's forcing you to read it, can be a good way of going about it. There's also a lot of really good visual arts, and beautiful memoir by Una, who is going to be speaking with us on April 14th, called Becoming Unbecoming, which kind of uses the graphic literature form of like comic books effectively to explore her experience of growing up as a child against the backdrop of the Yorkshire Ripper, and how that is kind of juxtaposed with her own experience of sexual abuse. And so just, again, different art forms that use drawing and literature are also kind of ways into kind of investigating your own experience. I feel like I was rambling, but anyway, I'll suggest a few more things in the chat, or I'll send it to you, Brittany, and then you can send it out to the others as well.
It's okay. I might... No, go, Joanna.
Just a very quick footnote to that. I mean, art therapy itself is incredibly helpful for a lot of people who may be more visual rather than literary in their approach to this. And of course, art therapy can take lots and lots of forms, including, I mean, the one that I'm most familiar with is people working, victim survivors working in tandem with a therapist to create either something that represents the trauma that they went through, and by creating it, sort of, you know, cathartic type response, or on the other hand, quite the opposite, creating these forms of art that represent a safe place, that represent healing, and this can be also a really productive way of dealing with the harms of sexual violence.
I see somebody put a comment on the chat about restorative justice and that as a way of dealing and healing. Somebody who works in Morocco, and I think that's I'd be quite interested to know your thoughts on restorative justice. I was talking to either Joanna or Winnie.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, why does restorative justice exist? Partly that's because a lot of people don't think that the existing justice system is working, which I agree with. In some ways, yeah, I don't know, right? I'm of two minds about this because, you know, for me, you know, I was lucky enough to have my rapist convicted, and he was sentenced to 8 years, and he served 4 years because of a certain policy in Northern Ireland. So a lot of people ask me, are you angry about that, the fact that he only served 4 years when he was sentenced to 8? And I'm like, yeah, I mean, you know, I won't say whatever because it makes me sound lackadaisical about it, but, you know, it's an arbitrary number, right? Because somebody committing the same crime in the United States would have probably gotten, you know, maybe 15 to 20 years, and somebody committing the same crime in another country would have gotten 2 years, right? So suddenly then you're comparing justice systems around the world, and you can look at that and be like, well, that's not very fair if, you know, he would have gotten 25 years in the States, but, you know, it's like, for me, am I going to get caught up on the differences between different justice systems when none of that really has anything to do with me, right? And also, if I look at all the other victims and survivors I know, very few of them actually had, you know, the benefit of their rapist being convicted. So, like, who am I to complain that my rapist was only behind bars for 4 years when other people had 0 for their rapist? So, for me, I kind of want to, you know, it's useful to not get hung up for me on whatever happens to that guy, right? Because at the end of the day, it's easier for me to say that because he was a stranger in my case, and I can imagine it's much more complicated for somebody who was, he was raped by somebody they knew or their partner or somebody in their family. But I at some point had to kind of divorce myself from whatever was happening to him. Strange, but since I ended up writing an entire novel about him, but, you know, divorce myself to whatever happened to him in real life and not get so hung up on, you know, if justice was being administered to him, because I realized the most important thing for me was to recover and rebuild my own life. So after a while, like, I moved, you know, across the globe to try to escape, you know, being in London, and you know, because I also needed to find a job, and I had a job across the globe somewhere. And then eventually I came back here to write the novel, and I was like, oh, do I want to be moving back to the same country or the country next door to where my rapist lives? And I'm like, you know what, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life trying to focus on where he lives, right? Because I need to live my life the way I want to live it and not get hung up on what's happening to him. So, you know, I guess restorative justice kind of speaks to that, because I guess it asks, are we going to get hung up on whether or not a legal sense of justice has been administered, or is there something that can happen that make us some kind of confrontation or some kind of conversation that enables us to feel that the other side is being confronted with the damage that they've done? And I think a lot of restorative justice initiatives do that, where it would be a victim of rape and not their rapist, but another rapist being in conversation, and something about that conversation allows those two perspectives to be shared and allows for some kind of understanding to be reached. And somehow that allows for some kind of emotional sense of resolution. Whether or not that works, I don't know, but certainly I know it has worked, or some victims come away feeling that they've been able to resolve some things for themselves emotionally. Whether or not that's fair, I don't know, because at the end of the day, I had to spend years of my life rebuilding my life. And if just a conversation is going to be enough punishment for a perpetrator, I don't know if that's entirely fair either. So, you know, we're dealing with flawed and imperfect criminal justice systems, and, you know, everything's quite arbitrary. So a lot of it's about what do you need for yourself to be able to kind of, I suppose, move on or rebuild your own life and to recover.
I was getting more at the kind of the concept, and Joanna might be able to comment more with her New Zealand origins, that this whole concept of forgiveness and healing, because it comes from the community where injustice has occurred within close-knit communities, where the individual has no choice but to, you know, see their perpetrator again. I don't know, Joanna, if, you know, from the new, because this is, you know, I have spoken to, and we have done some research looking at it, and it's very controversial, its use in addressing sexual violence, of course, but more from the kind of angle of whether it can has a role to play.
Yeah, I mean, I've done some work on this, and I think it's very interesting. I mean, I'm a New Zealander, and a lot of these early initiatives in the 1960s and 70s actually took place in New Zealand amongst, as you say, close-knit Maori communities, where there's a long tradition going back pre-white settlement of forgiveness, of these sorts of things that we today would call restorative justice. I think my view, though, on restorative justice is that it doesn't actually cut through the power relations that are at the heart of sexual abuse and sexual violence. And I think that's a real problem with it. I also think it's a problem that so many, I want to say all, but I don't know, but so many of these restorative justice schemes actually have been co-opted by the formal justice systems. And so they're not really performing the same function that they used to perform. I mean, in my view, if we are going to take seriously this aim that we have for a rape-free world, we actually need to think bigger than justice systems. Obviously, justice systems are crucial. I'm not denying that. That would be stupid. But we need to think about fundamental changes in our society, because we know which societies and which time periods of history sexual violence is low. It is low when you have high levels of gender and also intersectional equality. It is low in societies that have low military spending, low, no warring cultures. So, if we are going to tackle this issue, we actually have to tackle it not only at these individual levels, the justice systems, etc., and trauma systems, but we also need to actually look seriously at the fundamentals that are underlying high levels of sexual violence in our societies, and they have to do with power and inequality. I think we've actually run out of time.
Yeah, I'll go back to you on that because I think we're starting to talk.
Look, apologies to everyone who didn't get their points read out and paid attention to. Please just keep engaging with these issues, these questions. If we are to solve this issue of sexual violence in our communities, it's going to involve the labor of each and every one of us. We each need to use our own skills, our proclivities, our spheres of influence, whether it's as a writer or creative person, whether it's as a homemaker, whether it is as a academic, as a lawyer, as a police person. We all need to use our spheres of influence to try and forge a rape-free world. We have got some wonderful things coming up during Winnie Li's Writer in Residence here at the Shame Project. The next one is on the 14th of April, and it is called Literature and Sexual Trauma, Authors Writing Their Lived Experience. So please come. You do have to sign up, but it is for free. Just to conclude then, I just want to thank everyone for coming to this event. I want to thank Winnie, I want to thank Amina, I want to thank Clear Lines, and of course the Wellcome Trust, but also all the people behind the scenes who did such a lot. In particular, I'm thinking about the Shame team, so Stephanie Wright, Ruth Beecher, and of course Ria Sukdiosing, without whom nothing in Shame would happen. So thank you to everyone, and thanks for coming, and we will see you future events. Look on our website. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.